Li Lin sat in the sterile white chair, hands trembling slightly as she stared at the gleaming surgical instruments laid out on the table beside her. It was a small, windowless room in a top-secret genetic research facility, tucked away in the heart of a gleaming city that never seemed to sleep. Outside the walls of this building, the world spun on its axis, filled with problems too vast and complex for most people to address. But inside, Li Lin was about to do something revolutionary. She was going to change herself, and not just in the getting a new haircut sense, or even the going to the gym for a few months sense. No, this was going to be different. Li Lin, a rising star in genetic engineering, had volunteered to undergo an experimental procedure designed to merge human DNA with that of some of nature's most powerful creatures. Eagle vision. Cheetah speed. Ant strength. The procedure, conducted by a secretive team of scientists, was the latest advancement in gene editing, something Li Lin had spent years studying, theorizing, and perfecting. It was a leap forward, a step into a future where the lines between man and beast could blur. And today, she was going to be the first test subject. Are you ready, Dr. Li? Dr. Chen, the lead scientist on the project, asked from across the room, his voice calm but tinged with excitement. Li Lin nodded, her heart racing. She had read all the papers, all the reports. She knew the risks, the potential complications. But she was convinced that this was the future. She was ready for something more, something beyond the ordinary constraints of human existence. She smiled to herself, feeling the surge of ambition coursing through her veins. Ready, she said, her voice steady, though a tiny quiver of doubt lingered in her chest. Dr. Chen gestured to the team behind her. Activate the procedure. A soft whir filled the room as the machinery hummed to life. Li Lin felt a slight pressure against her skin as the needle entered her bloodstream, carrying the modified genes into her system. It was a strange sensation, not painful, but certainly invasive. For a moment, she felt as though she was falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. Her eyelids fluttered, and she could hear the faint whispers of the team members murmuring quietly in the background. But the world around her seemed to fade as the procedure took hold, and then, just like that, everything went black. When Li Lin awoke, the first thing she noticed was how clear everything was. The sterile white ceiling, the pale blue walls, the cold steel of the operating table beneath her, everything was in sharp, vivid focus. It was as if her eyes were new, sharper than they had ever been before. She blinked, adjusting to the new perception of the world. Her vision was nothing short of extraordinary. She could see the fine threads of dust drifting in the air, the individual fibers of the cloth covering the chair beside her, the smallest scratches on the table's surface. She could even see the faintest wrinkles forming at the corner of Dr. Chen's eyes as he bent over her, his face bathed in a look of mild concern. Dr. Li, he said, his voice more cautious than before. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Li Lin didn't respond immediately. She was too busy marveling at the new clarity of her surroundings. She could even make out the details of his corneas, the faint shifting patterns of light dancing across his face. It was like seeing the world through a microscope. She blinked again, then sat up, brushing off the small wave of dizziness that hit her. I see you, she replied, her voice calm, but laced with awe. I can see everything. Dr. Chen's brow furrowed, his expression shifting into something closer to admiration. Well, that's a very good sign. The first stage is complete. Li Lin stretched her arms, feeling a strange surge of energy rushing through her body. It wasn't just her vision, it was as if every muscle in her body had been replaced with pure, untapped strength. She could feel her limbs twitching with a kind of kinetic energy, as if they were vibrating, ready to explode into motion. She stood up, her legs feeling light, almost weightless beneath her. The world around her felt different, more intense, more vivid. She could feel every heartbeat, every breath, every muscle move, even the subtle way her skin shifted in response to the air in the room. But then came the strange sensation, the pull, a sharp, involuntary instinct that tugged at her like a fishing line hooked in her gut. It was an urge, primal and raw. A need to move, to act. Without thinking, Li Lin bolted forward, her legs propelling her across the room with an effortless speed that took her by surprise. She slammed into the wall with a soft thud, her hand instinctively catching herself before she could completely lose balance. "Whoa," she gasped, breathing heavily. She hadn't meant to run, at least, not like that. It had been as if her body had taken over, as if she was no longer in control. Dr. Chen stood frozen for a moment, blinking in disbelief. That's the cheetah speed kicking in. Li Lin laughed nervously, rubbing the back of her neck. I wasn't expecting that. Her mind was racing with the possibilities. She hadn't just gained enhanced vision, she had felt the raw power of speed and strength surge through her. Her body was no longer bound by the limitations of ordinary humans. I think this is going to be amazing, she said, almost to herself. But as the thrill of discovery rushed through her veins, something else began to stir. There was a primal hunger, an instinctual urge rising within her, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. She had never been one to be impulsive or reckless. But the feeling in her gut was compelling, and as her eyes flicked toward the door, she could sense it. She needed to run again. To chase something. To hunt. Dr. Chen, she said, turning back toward him, her voice now more intense. What happens next? Next, he hesitated, taking a cautious step back. Next, we monitor your progress. We'll check your strength, your stamina, and your... Li Lin's mind had already shifted gears. She wasn't interested in listening to another word about monitoring or protocols. She could feel the surge of energy coursing through her, the hunger for movement, the desire to test the limits of her new body. She was already thinking of ways to push herself to the extreme, ways to see just how far these abilities could take her. Later, she muttered under her breath, before rushing out the door, leaving Dr. Chen standing in stunned silence behind her. Outside, the city stretched out before her, a sprawling metropolis filled with towering buildings and bustling streets. But none of it mattered to Li Lin. She was aware of the cars and the people, but they felt distant, almost irrelevant. She could feel the pulse of the city beneath her feet, like an echo in her bones, and with a single thought, she took off. She didn't even think about it. She simply ran. It was instinct now, pure, unrefined. Like a cheetah chasing down prey, her legs moved faster than she had ever imagined possible. She dashed down the street, dodging pedestrians with ease, her body moving through the crowd like water flowing around rocks. Her speed was intoxicating, thrilling, and as she pushed herself faster, she could feel the world blurring around her. She didn't stop until she was standing at the edge of a bridge, looking down at the water below, breathing heavily, her heart pounding. Li Lin took a moment to savor the sensation of freedom. The animal inside her was waking up, but she had yet to realize just how dangerous it could be. Li Lin stood at the edge of the bridge, the wind whipping through her hair as she stared down at the dark water below. She could feel her chest heaving with the exertion of her run, but it wasn't exhaustion she felt, it was something else. Something primal, like a hunter after its prey, a constant tension in her muscles that urged her to move, to chase, to act. She flexed her fingers, feeling the strength in her hands, the raw power of the ant-like force that surged through her limbs. She'd never felt more alive, but there was a gnawing discomfort building inside her, a quiet warning she couldn't ignore. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. It was as if the animal instincts she'd gained had started to assert control over her thoughts. She should have been more careful, she knew that. But at that moment, there was no stopping the hunger, the need to feel the wind rush past her face, to run until the world couldn't keep up. For a moment, she considered jumping off the bridge, just to feel the fall, to experience the rush of speed and freedom that came with surrendering to gravity. But the thought was fleeting, replaced by an odd clarity. She didn't need to fall. She could outrun the world on her own 2 feet. Li Lin turned away from the edge, swallowing the lump in her throat. She needed to get control. This feeling, this wild impulse, wasn't something she could afford to let dominate her. She had gained these powers for a reason, but now, they were starting to feel more like a curse. She couldn't just give in to the rush every time she felt it. Not if she wanted to retain any semblance of who she used to be. With a deep breath, she forced her legs to slow down, focusing on the solid ground beneath her feet. She stood there for a few moments, eyes closed, listening to the distant hum of the city and the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. The urge to run was still there, still tugging at her, but she willed it away, forcing herself to think, to breathe. She needed a plan. She needed to figure out how to control this, but the problem was that she didn't know where to start. Back in the lab, Dr. Chen was pacing nervously, his hands clasped behind his back. He'd been hoping for a more controlled result, more time to monitor Li Lin's reaction, more tests, more analysis. But the moment she had rushed out of the room, he had known this experiment wasn't going to go as planned. He had expected excitement, maybe even curiosity, but not this. Need to break free. Li Lin was special. That much was clear. But with every great advancement, there was a cost. The animal DNA they had infused into her system wasn't just a gift. It was a catalyst, a trigger for instincts that had lain dormant in humans for millennia. And while Li Lin was undoubtedly intelligent, she was still human, still tethered to a mind that wasn't built to process the intensity of those instincts. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see his assistant, Mei, standing in the doorway, looking concerned. Dr. Chen, I've been monitoring Li Lin's vitals. Her heart rate's elevated, but stable. However, she hasn't returned to the lab yet. I know, he muttered. She left before I could even speak with her properly. I'm worried. Mei stepped inside, her expression thoughtful. Do you think the procedure's already having an effect on her? I don't think we've seen the full extent of it yet. Her enhanced vision is one thing. The speed, the strength, they'll only get more pronounced as her body adjusts. The more we push her limits, the more her instincts will take hold. We need to keep a close eye on her. If she doesn't learn to control them, we'll lose her. She'll lose herself. Dr. Chen rubbed his temples, deep in thought. He knew there was a way to manage the animal instincts, a way to train the mind to maintain control. But that kind of discipline took time. And time was something they didn't have. Li Lin's mind buzzed with thoughts as she walked back toward her apartment, her feet light on the pavement but her head heavy with the weight of what she'd just experienced. She had to admit, the speed felt incredible. It was like nothing she'd ever known. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was how quickly her instincts took over. How easy it had been to throw caution to the wind and let herself run wild. It wasn't just the speed that had surprised her. It was the hunger that accompanied it, the deep, gnawing need to chase something, anything. It was as though her body was trying to outrun something in her own mind, some part of her she couldn't understand, couldn't control. As she passed the small park near her building, she saw a group of children playing. Her eagle vision caught the flash of their laughter, the glint of sunlight on their tiny faces as they dashed across the grass, their movements quick and erratic. A wild thought, an impulse, flashed through her mind. It was almost like a reflex, like the instinct to catch them, to race after them and play the game of predator and prey. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. She had to stop thinking like this, but the pull was still there. The primal urge was not easily ignored. As she turned the corner toward her building, she was aware of every shift in the air around her, every change in the rhythm of the world. Her senses were heightened to an almost painful degree, as if everything was happening in slow motion. Her mind struggled to keep up. At her apartment, she unlocked the door with a feeling of detachment, as if she was barely present. She moved through the space mechanically, her thoughts a haze of conflicting desires. She needed to ground herself, to get a grip on reality. She couldn't just let the animal instincts take over. She was still herself, wasn't she? The mirror in her hallway caught her eye, and she stopped in front of it. For the first time, she looked at herself carefully, really looked. Her eyes were sharp, too sharp, the pupils slightly dilated. She could see every detail of her face with terrifying clarity. Every pore, every line, every flaw. She ran a hand through her hair, surprised to find it smooth, almost too smooth, like the kind of hair you might find on a predator. This wasn't who she was supposed to be. This wasn't what she had signed up for. A knock at the door startled her, breaking her reverie. She hadn't expected company. But when she opened it, Dr. Chen stood there, looking grim, his expression clouded with concern. Li Lin, we need to talk, he said, her stomach tightened at the sight of him. For a moment, she considered slamming the door shut, ignoring him, running away again. But something in his face stopped her. There was no judgment, no anger, just a quiet understanding. I know, she said, stepping aside to let him in. I don't know what's happening to me. Dr. Chen nodded, his eyes softening. You're experiencing the side effects. The animal instincts are already waking up, and they're stronger than we anticipated. They're taking over. And unless we address this soon, you'll lose yourself to them. You'll lose your humanity. Li Lin swallowed hard. She'd known something was wrong, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. She hadn't wanted to believe it. She thought she could control it, that she could use the power to her advantage, but now she understood the cost. What can I do? She asked, her voice small. How do I stop it? We can reverse the process, Dr. Chen said quietly, but only if you're willing to give up the abilities. You need to make a choice, Li Lin. You can't live as both human and animal. You'll have to choose one. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Li Lin felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had to make a choice. And for the first time since she had entered that lab, she wasn't sure which way to go. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the weight of possibility. She had always been ambitious, always searching for something more. But was this the more she had been looking for? Li Lin stood frozen in the doorway, her mind spinning, her heart thudding against her chest. Dr. Chen's words felt like a cold slap, a wake-up call she hadn't been ready for. The choice seemed so simple, so stark: give up the powers that had transformed her, or risk losing herself entirely. She glanced at Dr. Chen, his expression now softened, as though he were waiting for her to make a decision. But how could she? How could she give up what she had worked so hard for, what she had dreamed of for years? The strength, the speed, the clarity of vision, everything she had always wanted, everything she had thought would set her apart from the rest of the world. But now it felt like a trap, a gilded cage. And she couldn't shake the thought that perhaps she had already started to change, already started to become something unrecognizable. I don't know what to do, Li Lin said, her voice trembling despite herself. She stepped back into the apartment, rubbing her temples, trying to make sense of the swirling thoughts inside her head. I thought I was ready for this. I thought I understood the consequences. But this, Dr. Chen followed her in, standing awkwardly near the door, unsure whether to approach or give her space. You're not the first one to face this. We've run simulations, you know. The animal instincts are hard to suppress once they've been triggered. The longer they stay dominant, the harder it will be to pull you back. But I believe you can fight it. I've seen it before. It takes time. Li Lin laughed bitterly. Time. You don't understand, Dr. Chen. It's not just about fighting it anymore. I feel it. Every moment, it's like there's something inside me that wants to break free. I can't just shut it off. It's too powerful. I want to let go. I want to run faster, farther, to feel that rush again. And you can, he said, his voice quiet, but insistent. But you'll lose yourself in it. The instincts will start to control you. The more you give in, the harder it will be to remember who you are. To remember why you did this in the first place. You have to choose. Li Lin pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to gather her thoughts. She could hear her own breath, sharp and fast, her heart still racing from the speed she had felt earlier. The cheetah inside her was purring, urging her to give in. But something in the back of her mind, a small voice, whispered that it wasn't the right path. She didn't want to lose herself, not like this. She had always been the one in control, the one with the plan. But now, she felt like she was losing grip on everything. What if I don't want to give it up? What if I want to live with it? She asked, the words slipping out before she could think. Dr. Chen shook his head. You'll be choosing the animal over the human. And when that happens, you won't be the person who walked into that lab. You'll be something else entirely. Something uncontrollable. She turned away from him, pacing across the apartment. The walls felt too close, the space too small. Her senses were too sharp, too aware of everything, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, the faint sound of traffic from the streets below. It all felt amplified. And there, in the background, was the pull, the need to move, to run, to chase. She stepped toward the window, looking out over the city. The streets stretched endlessly before her, full of people moving about their lives, unaware of the power that was pulsing within her, growing with each passing second. The hunger was still there, gnawing at her, urging her to leave everything behind and just go. To become the animal, the predator, the unstoppable force. But as she stared out at the city, something inside her shifted. A part of her, the part that had gotten her to where she was today, the part that had always been calm and rational, fought back. She had worked so hard for everything she had. She had built a life, a future. She wasn't willing to throw it all away for the sake of power. I don't want to lose myself, she murmured to no one in particular. I've spent my whole life trying to be more than ordinary. I don't want to just vanish into some animal instinct. Dr. Chen stepped forward, his tone gentler now. You don't have to give it all up. There's a way to balance it, to keep the abilities while controlling the impulses. But it will take work. It will take focus. And you'll have to make a conscious choice every day. If you let it slip, I'll lose everything. Li Lin finished for him, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. It's the price you pay for the power. The next few days were a blur for Li Lin. She went through the motions, eating, sleeping, working, but her mind was always racing, always on the edge of a decision she hadn't yet made. The animal instincts inside her never fully quieted, no matter how hard she tried to ignore them. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel them creeping at the edges of her consciousness. And sometimes, when she moved too quickly, when she got too excited or too angry, she felt the urge to give in. It was like living on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step could send her spiraling into a world she wasn't sure she could control. She spent hours in the gym, pushing her body to its limits, trying to work off the restless energy that kept building inside her. The speed. The strength. The agility. They were all still there, still pulsing through her veins, but with each passing day, she felt the pull of the animal nature becoming stronger. She had made the decision, though. She wasn't going to let herself lose control. She would find a way to balance the power with the person she had been. But balance was harder to achieve than she had expected. One afternoon, as she jogged along the river, feeling the familiar sense of freedom that came with movement, she spotted something that made her pause. A woman, stumbling in the middle of the street, surrounded by a group of men. The men were laughing, jeering, their movements predatory. The woman was struggling to free herself, but they were stronger, bigger. Li Lin froze for a moment, her mind racing, the cheetah inside her suddenly awake and alert. The adrenaline hit her like a wave, and before she could stop herself, she was moving, faster than she had ever run before. Her legs were a blur, her body a machine of speed and power. The men didn't even see her coming. In a flash, she reached them, grabbing the first one by the collar and yanking him back, throwing him to the ground with a force that sent a shockwave through the street. The others barely had time to react before she was on them, moving faster than they could comprehend. Within seconds, the attackers were lying on the ground, groaning and dazed, the woman stood there, wide-eyed, trembling. Li Lin had done what she had never intended to do, she had acted. She had allowed herself to move, to fight, to be the predator. And now, she was standing over the defeated men, panting, her heart racing, but as she looked down at the woman, who was now gazing at her with a mix of awe and fear, something inside Li Lin snapped back into focus. This wasn't who she wanted to be. This wasn't the person she had fought so hard to stay. She had done the right thing, sure, but she had done it on instinct, without thinking, without control. Are you okay? Li Lin asked the woman, her voice surprisingly calm, despite the storm inside her. The woman nodded, eyes wide. Why yes. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. Li Lin gave a tight smile. Just, take care of yourself, she said softly, before turning and walking away. As she made her way back to her apartment, Li Lin felt the weight of her actions settle over her. She had done the right thing. But at what cost? Every instinct, every power was telling her to keep going, to embrace it. But for the first time, she truly understood the danger of what she was becoming. And no matter how much power she had, she knew one thing for sure, she couldn't lose herself to it. She couldn't let the animal take over, but she had already taken the first step. And the hardest part was yet to come.